In July 1888, a group of working class women and teenage girls did something radical. They walked off the job at the Byron and May Match Factory in Bow, East London. They were fed up with the pay, the punishments, and the poisonings. What they started wasn't just a protest, it was one of the first successful strikes by unskilled workers in British history. It lit the fuse for a new kind of labour movement, and it showed, loudly, that even the most marginalised people can fight back. To understand this strike, we have to go to the East End of London. In the late 19th century, it was a place of deep, grinding poverty. The slums stretched for miles, disease was rampant, the work was scarce, and what little work there was brutal. By the 1880s, the East End had become what some called an outcast London, a place so poor and so desperate that it felt like a different country within the capital. The journalist George Sims called it a living hell, with starving mothers and naked children. And this wasn't just sensationalism. In 1889, social researcher Charles Booth conducted an exhaustive survey of London's working class life. He colour-coded city streets based on poverty levels. The East End was shaded black and dark blue. Black for the lowest class, vicious and semi-criminal, blue for the very poor in chronic want. And in the thick of all of that was the Byron and May Match Factory. At the time, matches were essential. People used them to light candles, fires, stoves, everything. And Byron and May had the match game locked down. They were one of the biggest manufacturers in Britain, and the business was booming. But all that profit came on the back of the girls, many of them as young as 13, some even younger. Their workday started at 6 in the morning during the summer, 8 in the winter, and ended at 6 p.m. It was 12 hours done all standing. They were paid by the piece, so the faster you worked, the more you earned, but even then, most took home just 4 or 5 shillings a week. And then there were the fines. Dirty feet, fined. Talking, fined. Leaving a match out, fined. If you were late, you'd be locked out until midday and fined 5 pence. And they had to buy their own tools. But the worst part was something called phossy-jaw. It came from the white phosphorus used in the match tipping process. It caused your jawbone to rot from the inside. It disfigured, it paralysed, and it killed. And the factory workers barely blinked. Whilst the girls suffered, shareholders got dividends as high as 20%. If not for one woman, the strike may never have happened. Her name was Annie Besant. She was a journalist, a feminist, and a socialist fighter. She was already involved in the social reform when she'd heard during a Fabian Society meeting about the conditions at the Byron and May factory. The mismatch between the company's soaring profits and its starving workers were hard to ignore. So Besant did what she did best. She investigated. She spoke to the girls and she listened. And then she wrote. Her article, White Slavery in London, hit the streets on the 23rd of June 1888. It was an exposé, brutal, honest, raw. She detailed the fines, the standing, the jaw disease, and she called on the readers to boycott Byron and May matches. The factory bosses were furious. They tried to get workers to sign statements saying it wasn't true. And when one girl was fired for supposedly leaking info, roughly 200 workers dropped everything and marched straight into Besant's offices in Fleet Street. It was spontaneous, but it was the spark. Within days, 1,400 workers were on strike. Now here is where it gets really powerful, because the girls, they weren't supposed to have power. They were poor, unskilled, disposable. At least that's what the world thought. But they organised fast, and with Annie Besant's support, they formed a strike community, launched a strike fund, and reached out to the public for support. And the people listened. The London Trades Council threw their weight behind the strike. 50 of the strikers, teenage girls in factory aprons, marched to Parliament, and the public took notice. The newspapers were watching, the streets were watching, and suddenly these so-called white slaves weren't invisible anymore. They were fearless, sharing what little they had from the strike fund, encouraging each other to hold the line. One paper, The Justice, described the scene perfectly. They wrote about the contrast between the match girls in their worn clothes and the well-dressed women strolling the embankment. And yet, it was the factory girls who were changing history. Byron and May were rattled. The press was brutal. Public sympathy was pouring in. They had no choice. The company agreed to meet with the strike committee and representatives from the London Trades Council. On July 16th, 1888, they struck a deal. It wasn't just a deal, it was a victory. The company agreed to abolish unfair fines, allow a canteen so workers could eat away from dangerous workstations, and improve working conditions across the board. Now, it's true that white phosphorus wasn't banned immediately. This would take more pressure, and eventually, in 1910, Britain outlawed it altogether. But for the girls, this was huge. The next day, they went back to work, not defeated, not afraid, but triumphant. But the strike was never just about one factory. What the match girls did lit a spark that caught fire across the country. Their courage gave birth to something a bit bigger: New Unionism, a movement that said even unskilled workers have the right to organise. Just 1 year later, in 1889, the Gas Workers' Union was formed. They demanded and won the 8-hour working day. The same year, over 60,000 dock workers walked out in the Great Dock Strike, shutting down much of the River Thames. It was all a movement, and it all started with those girls in Bow. They shattered the stereotype of working class women as weak, passive or silent. They weren't victims, they were fighters. One witness said, "Few could fail to be touched by how determined the girls were to stand together at all costs." The 1888 Match Girls strike was more than a labour dispute. It was a line in the sand, and it showed that even the youngest, poorest and most underestimated voices could roar. It proved the power of media, of collective action and of cross-class solidarity. That when the most vulnerable stand together, they're not just powerless. Historians like John Charlton have said that the Match Girls' bravery deserves the same recognition we give the middle-class suffragettes who came later. And he's right. These were factory girls, undersized, underfed, underpaid. But in 1888, it changed the game. It reminds us that history isn't just dates and names, it's about sparks and what we do with them. So with that, I say goodbye.